2020, October 11th, 2024, Colorado Produced Water Consortium meeting. Appreciate everyone joining us here this morning. I know it's been a super busy time for many folks, and we've accomplished a lot over the last year with the Colorado Produced Water Consortium. We've got a couple things that I think we could accomplish today, and looking forward to the discussion. We've got some homework that we were assigned, and I want to create some time today to go through the different barriers and conversations that happened during the development of that homework, and kind of open up that conversation to help inform what ultimately will be our deliverable 7, which is on or before November 1st, 2024, any legislation or agency rules needed to remove barriers to the safe drinking and reuse of produced water in the state, taking into consideration a number of different topics. And we'll go through that when we're a little later in the agenda, and that's on the docket. But before we get to that, I want to hand it over to our esteemed director, Dalton, to share some announcements, housekeeping, and opening remarks.
Welcome to everybody, and I'm glad we figured out any tech issues, and I apologize for being late. Thank you for attending today's meeting. We will be focused only on one report, which is needs to be submitted by November 1st. And I am happy to report, as most of you know, our recommendations for a timeline and targets were accepted into the draft ECMC rules. And I believe the changes that ECMC staff made to operationalize the recommendations are good. So we'll see how that works out as the stakeholder input is taken. And then I guess I just wanted to remind everybody to raise your hand, and Commissioner Messner will call on you, as is standard in our virtual meetings. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Dalton. I wonder if you would just chat a little bit. I know that you've been busy presenting at a number of different conferences and had some speaking engagements, and maybe not to put you on the spot, but maybe share with us what you've been doing over the last few weeks, because it's been pretty interesting.
Well, thank you. So thank you, Chair Messner, for mentioning that. I completely forgot. Is Ember on the call? Ember?
I don't think she's on yet.
Okay. Ember and I went to the Colorado Sustaining Watersheds Conference in Avon on Wednesday, and we presented just an overview of the consortium's work and what we've been accomplishing over this past year. This was really well received, and the audience are people that are really watching Colorado watersheds and water rights and how to conserve water. The panel was industrial water use, and so we were on the panel with the Shoshone Energy Company, which I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, as well as a river district. And the audience, you know, their knowledge of produced water was pretty low at the beginning, and at the end, they felt really confident about how complex the produced water industry is and how we really can contribute to this overall reduction in freshwater use, specifically to industry, which was the topic. And really, the theme of the conference was flowing through change. And our work is truly innovative and unusual. And the fact that we're capturing so many diverse voices and opinions and perspectives at the beginning of our work is remarkable. And so everybody was in the audience was really impressed by how quickly we've been able to incorporate so many perspectives and to use data and science to inform our recommendations. So I was quite pleased that that our work is being well received.
Thanks, Director Dalton. That does speak a lot to the work of the consortium, and certainly speaks a lot to the work that you've done in leading us through those steps that we've taken. So want to make sure that you know how much we appreciate your guidance and leadership through this process. So thank you for that. I think next up is general public comment. I acknowledge that we at least got 2 written public comments that have been distributed to consortium members. I think maybe there was a third, Director Dalton, but now I don't remember.
Thank you, Chair Messner. And I also wanted to mention I will be presenting next week at ECMC to provide an overview of our work. So back to public comment, we received written comment from Susan Sherman, City of Aurora, Deborah Deal Blackwell from 9 Power Clean Water. Those 2 have been provided to the consortium. Christine Misbanksky, and apologies to the public if I'm mispronouncing your name. I really try hard, but I do make mistakes. From QB Energy Operations, I just sent Christine's public comment to the consortium, so you may not have seen it. I also just recently received from the form Julian David Saran Gonzalez said that they would be submitting public comment. I haven't written public comment. I haven't received that. If Julian's on the in our meeting, maybe we can see if Julian wants to speak.
Yeah, so that's the next step. If there is anyone that is in attendance at the meeting that has not signed up for public comment, but would like to provide public comment, now would be the time to do so. If you are interested in providing public comment generally on the meeting topics, feel free to raise your hand and we can elevate you to the panel.
I have elevated Julian. Hopefully,
so, Julian, you're elevated to the panel. If you did have a public comment you'd wish to provide verbally at the meeting here today, you can unmute yourself and let us know. If you did intend just to provide written public comment, then no pressure, don't feel like you have to provide a verbal public comment today. Okay, I'm not seeing Julian unmute him or herself. And so I think we'll move forward. I don't see any other hands raised in the attendee list. And so to the agenda itself. So before we start the agenda, I do want to acknowledge that Director Dalton will be presenting to the Energy and Carbon Management Commissioners next week, right? And to give an overview of all the work we've done over the last year, which seems really hard to do because we've done so much work over the last year. But all the reports that we've developed, the conversations we've had, providing a summary to the Energy and Carbon Management Commissioners to help them better understand the work that we've done, the complexities of the conversations that we've had, and to give them a good background of how we came to the recommendations that we did to allow for them to have that knowledge moving into the produced water rulemaking, which will happen at the end of the year. And if anyone's interested in more information about the ECMC rulemaking around produced water, There's lots of information available on the ECMC website. There's opportunities for public participation and for folks individually to become parties to that rulemaking. And so it's important to note that we as a consortium will not be a party to the rulemaking, but that does not preclude individual consortium members from being parties in the rulemaking. However, you should not represent yourself as representing the consortium in the rulemaking, but rather yourself individually or with whatever organization that you happen to be with. So any questions about that before we move into the homework discussion? Ms. Sorensen?
Yes, I just want to mention on that, Mr. Chair, that the party submission for the produced water rulemaking deadline did pass last Friday, the 4th.
Well, that could be. I did not look at the website before.
So that deadline has actually passed in terms of reaching party status.
However,
a public comment is always welcomed.
That's correct, and that's true through the process. So, with no other questions, I think we'll move into the homework. And I want to frame this a little bit, and then let Director Dalton also frame it. Right, Director Dalton, you have a presentation on this one, or the actual deliverable 7 after that?
Actually, I'd like to start with each of the groups reporting out on their homework assignments. Yep. And then I have a presentation on the current report that I sent out for comments. And then I'd like to open it up for further discussion. Thank you, Chair Messner.
Yeah. So we'll start with the homework assignment conversation then. And so I know a lot of people took some time to get together and have a conversation to identify deliverables that the consortium would like to see completed in the 2025-2026 work of the consortium, with the guardrails that many of the barriers to the safe reuse and recycling of produced water will be more clearly identified after the ECMC produced water rulemaking, where the timeline and targets would be incorporated into the ECMC rules, whatever those may be. And kind of a bigger picture framing of this is, this conversation is really designed to identify those potential barriers to help inform the information that ultimately would be incorporated into deliverable 7, which again is on or before November 1st, 2024, any legislation or agency rules needed to remove barriers to the safe recycling and reuse of produced water in the state, taking into consideration a number of different topics, including environmental justice issues, legal issues, testing standards, treatment standards, research gaps, water share agreements, and infrastructure and storage. And I know those kind of general topics are, a lot of topics that have been brought up in the past. I think it would be this conversation I hope we're going to have here is really going to flesh out identifying some of those, because I think this report, we're not going to solve these issues today. We're not going to solve these issues in this report. We're identifying the issues. And the goal of identifying those issues is to set the stage for the next couple of years of work of the consortium as we work through each of those topics individually and develop reports or whatever relevant information we need to develop associated with each of those topics to be able then to better inform ourselves, our stakeholders, state agencies, federal agencies, and the legislature. And so that's the goal here today, is really just to have kind of a brainstorming identification of those barriers and allow Director Dalton to take that information, incorporate it into that deliverable 7 report, which is really ultimately going to be an identification of those issues for further work and research. Does that make sense? So with that, I'm seeing in the chat, we've got the different groups. And so I'm just going to go through and start. So we've got group 1, whose members were Tessa Sorensen, Thomas Borch, Michael Freeman, John Lipka, Doug White, Amber Michael, and Kevin Chan. And so I'm not sure who wants to speak for the group.
So John, I can do that. Tessa or Kevin, I think we're the members of our group on today. Do you want me to go ahead? Would you guys like to report out?
It's all you, Mike.
Thank you.
And,
Okay.
and I do want to note that, you know, even though each of the individual groups will present out here, afterwards, I'm going to open the discussion to anyone that has any additional topics or things that they want to bring up. So don't feel like your voice is not going to be heard. I want to have a broad discussion. So go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. I apologize for the background noise. My Wi-Fi at home went out about 15 minutes before we started, so I'm doing this from a coffee shop. Can everyone hear me okay though? Okay, great. So we had a good conversation a couple of weeks ago about this and came up with, I think, 5 or 6 ideas. And I'm just going to read them off from the report we sent to Hope. And Kevin and Tessa or others, if you have thoughts, just jump in. The first idea was to consider amending the statutory ban on centralized water treatment facilities in DICs so that the ban would be based on proximity to people rather than trying to cover the entire census block. And this was something that Tessa and I suggested. The idea being just on the western slope, there's already a lot of reuse happening, but given how much of Garfield and Rio Blanco counties are DICs, we think maybe there's the potential to maintain really strong protections for communities without limiting opportunities in less populated parts of those counties that might be important to use. The second idea was a suggestion that Thomas offered, which is to request state funding for a life cycle analysis model of recycling and reuse. And the idea there would be that kind of an analysis can provide a lot more detail and data on what the infrastructure costs of recycling might be, what the potential carbon footprint of that could be, and then what kind of necessary water storage and gathering lines would be needed, and to drill down on those issues with a lot more information and specificity that we've had so far, and build on the data we have for making decisions. The third idea, this is one that Doug and I suggested, would be this could probably be done in the rulemaking, but to create a recycling mechanism that would provide an incentive for operators who can exceed the regulatory targets. And the idea would be if let's say one operator has the infrastructure and is in a good location where they can recycle more than just what the targets are, they can go beyond that, and then they could either sell or transfer, get a credit for the additional recycling they're using. They get and either sell or transfer that to operators who are, not in a position to recycle as much or have a harder time doing it, like small operators, with the idea being that we could, get more recycling done on a basin-wide basis, but also accommodate operators who are having trouble reaching targets or in a position where it's either more expensive or creates more impacts for them to recycle their water. And Doug pointed out that this could also provide an alternative for smaller operators who could actually contribute, even if they're not using recycled water themselves, contribute their produced water to a recycling operation that could, and if it was being used there for recycling and reuse, they could get credit for that, which would give them an incentive to tap into the system as well. The fourth suggestion, this is offered by Thomas and John, would be to revisit the laws governing treatment and discharge of produced water, the surface waters, and the use of produced water outside the oil field. And as part of this, the thought would be to revisit or update or streamline standards for water testing and procedures. Thomas, I see you're on now, so feel free to jump in if you have anything more on that. The fifth idea, and this is something Doug offered, considers state regulation to allow temporary storage and recycling equipment to remain at a single site for longer time periods without requiring permanent local or county land use approvals. Like, for example, as I understand what Doug explained, currently in Weld County, temporary equipment can't remain on site for more than 180 days without getting formal county land use approvals. But if a regulation allowed, mobile recycling facilities to stay on site more than 6 months, it might allow for more flexibility in doing that. And then the last one we had was an offer, something Doug added, which is that if the state might consider removing the regulatory limit on total injection volumes for disposal wells and revise the standard for determining interference based on actual pressure data rather than on a linear measurement of the injection zone radius to facilitate necessary water storage and support reuse and recycling. And I'll confess, I'm reading off an email from Doug, and I don't really understand the details of that, but that's something he wanted to add in, so I wanted to report out on that too. So that's what we've got. Doug, Tessa, or Kevin, or Thomas, anything to add on those?
I think that captured things pretty well. I'm sorry I'm late here. Just one meeting went a little too late, so I don't know if you went through all the different items that we had listed and shared with Hope.
Yeah, I just read out from what we sent to Hope last week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for doing so.
Great, really appreciate that, and good ideas. And I think I want everyone to understand that these are great brainstorms, and we need to have these brainstorms, and I hope that we can capture these to the public that's listening. These are ideas that are being thrown out for further evaluation and conversation, and so these aren't things that we are recommending, but are identifying for further conversations for potential recommendation or potential not recommendation, but things that we would like to have further conversations on, further research on, in the upcoming consortium meetings over the next year or two. And so just so that there's not a perception that these are things that we're recommending today, but rather we're hoping to have further conversations about these. And I think that was a great list to start off that brainstorm. So thank you for that. I think next up, we've got John Heil, Brandy Honeycutt, Zahi Kath, Harmony Cummings, Mark Hefta, Commissioner Pinter, Eric Anglin, Irene Andrus. Who would like to speak for that group? Anyone?
Hey, this is Mark Hefta. I can read off our group's comments if I don't know if anybody else wants to hop in and add some comments, but I'll just read them off. First one was identification of additional data to inform what if scenarios. Second one was interpret how ECMC cumulative impact rulemaking can work together with the rules around produced water. Additional investigations into water sharing agreements, including standards, testing related to pooling produced water resources. Identify produced water equivalents. Focus on understanding community impacts, including potential environmental justice issues and impacts to our hydrological cycle, and identify a treated produced water standard through data on treatment, water quality, community impacts, so that it opens more opportunities for managing produced water reuse and recycling. I think those are our joint. I think we came to those jointly. Those weren't specific to any individuals, but that was our summary. So
that's great. Thank you for that. Those are all also very good topics for consideration. So appreciate your work on that. Again, after we have these initial presentations, I certainly want all the consortium members for further information. Irene, I see your hands up, so go ahead and add some additional thoughts now if you like.
Yeah, I think we also had on our list doing pilots for major basins.
Okay. Commissioner Pinter?
Yeah, just to chime in, and thanks. It was a group effort, and Brandy Honeycutt took the bulk of it. I'm looking at my other screen where I have the notes pulled up. And Brandy did a great job in documenting the conversation, and which I feel was really robust. And I just wanted, for a point of clarification, to make sure that our homework was available to others as our notes were produced, and that we would be able to look at everyone else's work product as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and we can certainly make that happen. I'm not sure if that's happened yet, but I think that certainly can happen. Director Dalton, is that fair to say?
Thank you, Chair Messner and Commissioner Pinter. I have made the homework available to all consortium members. It's still in a working draft, but I can put that on the website for the public after this meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, next is group 3, which is Doug Overton, Tracy Kozloff, Peter McMahon, James Rosenblum, Barbara Vasquez, Jeff Kirtland, Clay Terry, and Jolie Bronner.
Mr. I'll take that to represent the group, and good morning, everyone. Effectively, you're going to hear a lot of redundancy in some respects. We really spent some time sort of building on the comments of previous groups. In particular, identifying where there are gaps in understanding around some of the existing tools that are in play. Related to water sharing agreements. I think there's some opportunities to really dive into those types of processes and identify where there are barriers that makes this challenging. And I think there was a lot of discussion around operator to operator versus operator to commercial, and really having a clear understanding of how to manage that appropriately. What's already been mentioned with respect to data and the gaps that exist in data, there was a considerable amount of discussion around ensuring that in addition to the standards of analytics and the testing procedures, really understanding the compatibility with respect to water within the existing formations to ensure that we're avoiding problems within the formation. Excuse me. This is more of a geological, understanding, but making sure that we sort of use this concept of compatibility, making sure that the water that's coming from that formation is also being somewhat utilized in similar formations. With respect to reuse inside the field and looking at surface storage, a lot of emphasis on really the emission sources and this continued discussion around the existing rules that ECMC has in place in the Series 900 rules, how that relates to CDPHE permitting processes and how those work together, and really considering the cumulative impacts of air emissions under the agencies that work together with respect to that. Building on that and ensuring that there's a clarity in how we communicate to the public about how that's understood, really showcasing what the industry is doing to protect the public and meet the current requirements, whether it's emissions or spills, but also build on how we can, ensure that there's clarity between agencies there. In terms of subsurface storage, again, just more discussion around Class 2 injection wells and that withdrawal. I won't go into details. I think others have touched on that already. For reuse outside of the oil and gas, our recommendation is really focus on reuse in field at this point, because there's a lot of unknowns and really the low-hanging fruit is within infield use. But can we look at ways that operators can get credits for meeting recycled water targets within that? I think I covered all of our major points there. Barbara or anyone was part of the group. I don't know if you have any additional items that I've missed, but happy to turn it over to whoever needs to add to it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for providing the summary for all of us. I just want to reemphasize that this whole group decided we really need to focus on reuse within the industry before, walk before we run, and that perhaps the learning that's done for reuse within industry could smooth the way in the future for reuse outside.
Great, thank you for that. So the next group was Trisha Pfeiffer, Joe Ryan, Chloe Danforth, Michelina Pollock, Rick McCurdy, Nikki Wells, myself, and Jacob Smith. Really, this group, however, was Michelina Pollock, and so she worked hard to try to get us together, and unfortunately, we were really struggling to get together. I think individually, there were some members of the group that provided some comments, but I do want to hand it over to Michelina Pollock because she really represented our group on this one.
Thanks, Chair Messner. I'll have to pull up the notes because I just realized I have a confession is that I never sent Hope my notes from group 4 because I'm looking at the homework and I was like, well, why isn't the pilot project in there? Why isn't it this? So I'm a disaster myself, apparently. But I do want to send a shout out to group 4. There was some pretty extraneous challenges for individuals of our group. And so we were sending thoughts and love. So I just want to say that. But let me pull up what group 4 said. And I will add Hope, the investing or considering pilot programs or pilot studies projects within any of the basins. But a couple of the ideas were identify how to quantify and measure community impacts, focusing on establishing oil and gas production basin specific requirements by a certain date in order to have time to analyze the new data from Form 7 and 47. Form a work group that meets separately from the consortium as a whole to evaluate analytical and toxicological methods for uses outside the oil field for the July 1st, 2025 report, while also considering how to identify and track community impacts, including targeted outreach per the consortium strategic plan. Investigate pilot projects in and all basins that promote reuse, recycling, and produced. I'm going to just pull up my notes here really quick also. And Thomas had mentioned this at a couple of meetings, and I tried to capture it. But he made a really good point about it would be good to evaluate community risk from the perspective of continuing using fresh water for oil and gas development versus treating and recycling water for O&G development. So I can send this to you, Hope, so that I'll just copy and paste it into the chat. But I just wanted to recognize that of course I didn't send to Hope. Noticing I did not email her. John, did you want to add anything else? Because him and I had a fun Friday morning coffee chat for 15 minutes and solved all the world's problems. I mean, in 15 minutes.
Yeah, I wish it was that simple, right? I do think that there's, some additional potential barriers that I would throw out there. And I think there's some legal and liability issues, legal issues from a water rights standpoint, and I think in the water share agreements, but the transfer of liability or not, depending on how all that works. I think there's, some clarity in the way that things have been happening up until this point, but I think some operators would like more certainty and clarity on the legal issues associated with liability and water rights. And I think that makes some sense for us to dive into a little bit. I'll just reiterate what a lot of people have said. I think, understanding testing standards and different treatment standards and a deeper look into classifications of different types of water based on treatment standards, I think makes a lot of sense for us to dive into. And then, I would like to see us do a deep dive into infrastructure storage. And I know that we've done that, to an extent with our deliverable that we did this year. I would also like to just do a deep dive into what infrastructure mechanisms are available for transportation of produced water. What infrastructure mechanisms are most efficient, different type of materials, different strategies. So I'm certainly curious on that. And then storage as well, whether that's underground storage, above ground storage, closed top storage, open top storage. I think that conversation, current technology versus potential future technology, is there things that can be learned from other water storage industries? And so a deeper dive in that I think would be super interesting and useful as well. And so those are just my individual thoughts on that. But I think a lot of the things that have been brought up by the other groups are things that Michelina and I had talked about as well. So, but also want to emphasize that I would like to see this consortium continue as we move forward in these topics to not only have policy conversations about this, but really look more into research and pilot projects and education, building our education on new and emerging technologies. So with that, I would like to open it up to anyone else that has ideas, because again, our goal here with this conversation is to provide Director Dalton with the thoughts of the consortium, on identifying these things that we want to place in deliverable 7, but also really will help guide us in the work that we'll do over the next year or two. And so I open it up to consortium members to share any other thoughts on this topic. And Rick, I'm looking at you because this would be the first time that you haven't raised your hand on this topic.
Let me get unmuted. Thank you, Commissioner. So a couple of things I would say here. Number one is I am a big fan of pilot projects because I think that can give us a lot of information in the future, and particularly around maybe some projects doing with different kinds of ways to move produced water around in the basins. We definitely need that's one of the considerations. If we're really going to increase recycling, particularly in the DJ Basin, we've got to be able to move produced water around and try to do it in ways that doesn't involve trucks. So that could be temporary piping. It could be above ground lay flat hose, dual walled lay flat hose. It could be HDPE piping that's weldable. And we need to take a look at that. With regards to deliverable 7, I think we need to add some language in there that the very first thing we need to do is a techno-economic analysis of this concept of pulling already injected water back out of these formations. And we've talked about this at a couple of our meetings. Is number one, the majority of our disposal zones in Colorado, luckily, are not overpressurized, but that means they will not flow a column of water back to surface. So that means we're going to have to go in, take the tubing and take the packer that's in the well, remove it, run back in with tubing with the most likely electric submersible pump on the end of it in order to push water back up to surface. That's not cheap, neither one of those items are cheap. We're going to have to put all new electrical installations at the wellhead because we're not going to have 480 volts to run this electric submersible pump at the wellhead. We will back where the disposal pump is at, but not at the wellhead. So we need to just take the time first to go, is this possible? Would we be able to pull and just do a geological analysis? Or are we going to be able to pull a significant quantity of water out of these wells that would really make a difference? And if so, what's it going to cost to do that?
No, I think that's fair. Appreciate that. Harmony? Harmony? Oh, you're muted, Harmony.
So many buttons. There's just a few things in this conversation that make me cringe when I hear them. A few of them is outside oil field use, and that was never at all the intent. And so until we have things dialed down in reuse of something greater than 4% for inside the oil field, we should not be looking at anything or even having entertaining conversations, wasting our breath, time, or energy. And I hope this is the last time I have to say that. And I know that there's a lot of people with a lot of concerns in passing this legislation who were like, absolutely not. And I swear that wasn't even supposed to be in there, but legislation is legislation. The second one is incentives for the industry. I'm going to say that the billions of dollars that the industry makes are the incentives already. Doing things to be protective, to make lesser impacts on the earth is incredibly important. And especially coming off of Colorado's Oil and Gas Week, where they brought in scientists to admit for the first time that oil and gas does have an impact on climate change, but it's not significant and it's very small. And actually climate change is having a very little impact right now on the earth. And I look at what's going on in Florida and I don't feel that way at all. And so I just really want to take a minute to flag that I am terrified for the future. And I think we need to be looking at things differently. What was the final one on my list that I wrote down? Oh, the thing that I also struggle with in these times on a human scale and just at making things, if they make sense for what we're doing. I know it's really important to do these things without additional emissions, but what does that actually mean? Does that mean what I think that means, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, that we are putting in renewable energy or solar purposely for the extraction of oil and gas? And how does that get us out of the cycle of our impending doom for this planet? Because it doesn't make sense to me. And I know these are Harmony saying Harmony things, but I'm going to name them here.
Thanks for your perspective, Harmony. I'll reiterate that this is a brainstorm of things to have these conversations on in the future. We're not solving anything today. So, Irene.
Oh, hi, thanks, Irene Andrus. So working off of what Rick was saying, Rick, I wasn't seeing this so much as retrofitting wells that are already done for injection wells. What I was thinking is, what can be done in the future? So is there some design that we could be doing with going forward on injection wells, where what we do is we know at that point that what it's doing is it's going to be a storage place for the water until we need it. And is there a better way to design these so that it can be done that way? Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Commissioner Pinter.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for this robust conversation. Again, going off of what Rick started us out as, I really appreciated that phraseology that you use, because I think it shows a clarity of what we're up against, the techno-economic analysis. And I really respect that there is a feasibility to any engineering project that we all undertake. Unfortunately, if we limit the scope of our analysis to technologically feasible or economically viable, what it does is it leaves out a community analysis of the different impacts on community when we only look at those two factors. So, and I appreciate to begin to have the conversation about community impacts, sometimes you have to understand the technological feasibility to be able to communicate to community. And so I really appreciate how you laid that out, but I think it's missing a critical consortium has brought up again and again. So as we're having those conversations, for each of the factors, there is going to be an economic cost and a community cost and a long-term community cost and risk analysis for insurance purposes or community safety. Water is no joke, and water can do a lot of harm. Even small amounts of water. So I appreciate that we are taking water seriously. I also wanted to my last comment is about the phraseology around outfield versus infield, and I appreciate what Harmony was communicating about infield as a priority. And again, I've heard that infield is the priority of this group from the beginning, but I would encourage us to be really careful with our language, because infield can mean a lot of different things. And what I've actually heard coming from Commissioner Messner, and if I'm missing the point, please help me out, is that we're actually talking about downhole when we talk about infield, but those two words mean different things. In the field versus downhole reuse. And I think the consortium has expressed that our first priority is downhole feasibility versus anywhere in the field. And so, again, would encourage us to be careful with our language about the intention of where the water could be used.
Two excellent points and good clarification. So thank you for that. Jolie?
Thank you very much, Jolie Bronner. Emma said a few things, so instead of 3 points, I think I only have 2. Thank you for that. Community impact was a big piece. I just want to second what Emma was saying on that. Another one, these definitions for our glossary, I would love us to have a more clear definition of what the parameters for infield are. And then the other ones, if we're going to have conversations around incentivization for this work, I want us to have the other side of penalties. So if we're going to talk about incentivizing, we also have to talk about penalties. I want to talk about both. And then this idea of a case study or a pilot project keeps coming up. What if it was a case study instead? That might be less of a lift for us because there's existing data in the ecosystem. And so I keep hearing this come up where we keep saying, pilot project, and the runway for a pilot project is so long and it's a lot of work. And so maybe we can start looking at that as what can we do as a case study with data that exists for folks that are doing things well, because that does exist. So we can look at that and use it as a barometer for success across the ecosystem. Thank you.
Also, very good points. Thanks, Jolie. Tessa?
Yeah, I want to kind of tack on to that about maybe seeking operator partners on that front, just because they're the ones that have the facilities in place often, or have the ability to kind of do these case studies or partner with us to show these case studies, right? So you could even get in between with a shorter runway between a pilot project and a case study by using pre-existing infrastructure or new infrastructure that's being put in place right now, even just for multi-pad operations for the recycling water, to show kind of what that looks like and what the barriers they've faced are for any operators they're willing to share some of their data or their operational design that way to kind of inform that. I think that would be a really good opportunity. And I'd love for the industry operators to, the industry representatives here to kind of chime in as to whether that's a good idea to put on our list to look at on that front. And just to tag on to the other things about infield versus downhole, I think agnosticism is key in order to reach success. And so I think being able to add to all of these discussions a context of how can we be as agnostic as possible while still accomplishing the goals that we're looking at doing to achieve that, I think is really important to frame most of these conversations. Because if you get really, really specific and really, really prescriptive, it rarely works as well.
Thanks, Tessa. Other thoughts? Thomas?
I just wanted to comment on the subject of reuse outside the oil and gas field. There are many situations where the water that comes up from these wells of such high quality, including studies that we're doing in eastern Colorado, but where to develop infrastructure for recycling for another frac job is simply not, a likely solution because there's no development maybe in some of these areas. So there's actually a lot of opportunities to take that water and discharge it into surface waters, right? Or to reuse it for agricultural purposes. And it's something that is being explored a lot in Texas. EPA right now trying to rethink the discharge requirement for water quality, especially in the Permian and also maybe in the Delaware Basin. So it's coming. So if we don't here in Colorado at least have that discussion going about potential reuse when it makes sense, when it doesn't make sense to develop infrastructure for recycling for another frac job, if there is no development of fracking, when the water quality is so high that it can nearly with minimal treatment be reused for beneficial uses, I think it should be considered, at least at a discussion level here for this group.
Thanks, Thomas. I do not want us to get off track here and have a debate about this. This is identification of issues, but appreciate you bringing that up, Thomas. Harmony?
I think that Thomas's point really brings up the need for why we need to be looking at things with a basin by basin approach, because it is significantly different by basin. And I know in our last, and sorry, I get the things confused of where we look at that and where we don't look at that, and deliverable 6 or 5 or blah, blah, blah. But the basins are significantly different. The water that is coming out in the southern part of the state, significantly different. But that said, that is such a small percentage of the water used in oil and gas operations. And really the intent is for using less fresh water. And so if that's where we're going to be looking at, we really, really, really need to be impacting what's going on in the DJ. And so I really appreciate your comments, but I think we need to go for where we get more meaningful impact on our water supply. And I do, and again, echoing a by basin approach for data, for how we strategize, how we look at things, because it's like different worlds.
Well, so just very quick, our study is based on the DJ basin, but it's conventional wells that are extracting oil and gas from sandstone, and the TDS levels are less than 3,000. So this is the DJ basin, but it's from sandstone and not from shale. So we do have a lot of conventional wells too in Colorado. And so it's just, if you're not going to talk about conventional wells and the potential for reuse of high quality water, that should just be very clear, I think, for this consortium.
No, I think it's point well taken, Thomas. I do think I think just this conversation identifies the need for us to have a deeper conversation about it. And I think that is important. And I take Harmony's comments around the basin specific stuff, the geological specific stuff, the differences between conventional and unconventional. I think it just highlights the differences of things that need further conversation. And so I appreciate that. And I think will be captured here. Other thoughts? You got all that, right, Director Dalton?
Thank you, Chair Messner. I have captured most of it, and the consortium members have been putting in the chat like a quick summary of some of the things that I might have missed. So I may have to follow up with individual consortium members just to make sure what I heard is what I captured.
That's great. Rick?
So just briefly, I really do appreciate both Harmony and Thomas's comments, and definitely am very interested in that for the future. But in our last deliverable, we established what we all agreed to were realistic targets for recycle, particularly in the DJ basin. But I mean, we were looking statewide. What I would like to really see us focus on now is, and this is just a suggestion, is what can we do from an infrastructure, from a storage, from a movement standpoint to exceed those targets? Because as has been said here several times today, that's the low-hanging fruit. That's the quickest, biggest impact we can make to reducing fresh water in oil and gas operations, is using it using produced water in place of fresh water, particularly for completions.
Good point, Rick. Michelina?
Thanks, Michelina Pollock. A couple of things. One, I want to reach back to what Tessa was saying about the operators making the lift. And then I want to clarify the semantics, Jolie, about a case study versus a pilot. So there is a tremendous amount, you're right. If you've read the literature review from our deliverable number 1, I think. So, but the difference for me is a case study versus a pilot is expanding on what we already know from case studies and literature review. And then I have my own little club here called the San Juan Basin Consortium of Produced Water. And I said, hey guys, as operators that are small business, by the way, they're not billion-dollar major oil companies. So I want to be very clear that we have a wide range of economic businesses here in oil and gas in Colorado. So I've asked them to look at and think about, if we were to have to recycle, reuse, here's the targets that have been projected and discussed. What would you do? You know, and that goes back to what Tess is saying. I think the producers are willing to expand more, not on a case study, but as a pilot project, right? We have infrastructure here in the San Juan Basin that can utilize that. So I just want to know, I want to understand what you mean by exploring case study semantics versus pilot.
Go ahead, Julie.
Excellent. Thank you. Totally agree. It was more when we, I froze. There we go. It was more when we spoke with the staff timeline-wise. We have a very tight timeline, and I'm concerned about deliverables. I'm concerned about us getting tied into a pilot project where we start supporting this project and we stop talking about community impacts, or we stop talking about all of the other pieces we need to focus on if we're running some sort of pilot study. If there's a collaborative way to do it, I'm all ears. I just heard in one of our earlier meetings from some staff that might be too large of a lift. So that was me offering an alternative to how can we maybe look at data that exists to talk about how this works in the real world. So it was more of a suggestion of how do we look at these two options of which will serve better with the time restraints we're sitting under with, you know, obligational deadlines for reports and all of the topics that we have to cover. So fully agree. Case study is not the same as a pilot project. I was more elevating what are our goals with the case study? What are our goals with the pilot project? Pardon me. And can we achieve that with a case study with existing data? I'm hearing from you now, we can't. So I think that's interesting, but that was my question was, can we do that? Not we should ignore it completely. It was more of a suggestion for timeline restrictions.
Well, and I might offer, I think yes to all of it is something that is worthy of further discussion. And, you know, I think there's opportunities for case studies. I think there's opportunities for pilot projects. I think there's opportunities for further research. I think this consortium has the opportunity to dive deep into each of these topics and make a determination as a consortium, a recommendation on certain steps for certain things in certain areas. And I think that this conversation is a great example of you know, the benefits of diving deeper into these topics and further conversations without the timelines associated with some of the deliverables we had to work through this year, because starting in January, we're going to set our own timelines. We're going to set our own deliverables. And I think that really opens up some opportunities for us. And so I think they're all good ideas. And so I'll just throw that out there. But Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the in-between. That's why when we discussed potential opportunities for the future, and Michael mentioned it in his report, that there's also something called life cycle analysis, right? And we can model. So you can take existing data from the literature, you can put them into life cycle analysis models that includes, you know, the techno-economics, the engineering aspect, the social aspect, right? The water quality that we want to the water quality goals that we want to reach. And then you basically put all of the data into one model and you optimize for different scenarios that are relevant for Colorado. So it could be water volumes, it could be the cost for establishing the treatment that is required, and so it can be, you can actually evaluate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that you're producing when you treat a barrel of oil and so forth and so on. So, life cycle analysis, including some techno-economic analysis that are specific for example, the DJ Basin was what we proposed to do. And that would be something in between, a pilot and what is already out there in the literature. And then we might also identify knowledge gaps, because I keep hearing people saying, hey, we don't have data. So if we don't have data, it doesn't help to do a case study based on the literature if the data is not there. So, it's the chicken and egg here. But I think life cycle analysis would be a cheaper and option that could be accomplished within a short time frame, a year or 1.5 years, 2 years. So depending on the scope.
Thanks, Thomas. Kevin?
Yeah, I just want to raise with, community. Again, there's been a lot of times where I honestly feel that government has kind of failed community in terms of, just the number of agencies involved and things like that. And, I want to raise that some of the remedies to that was the EPA community science program, and with the various aspects of getting the community involved and making them do and giving them the resources to do their own research and make sure that what the scientists are saying is actually factually correct. I think as a Produced Water Consortium, we can get the community involved and kind of help them with that, or at least provide some resources for them in joint with the EPA, since those programs are already set up, to provide that, I guess, safety net or some sort of mechanism for them to understand the work that we're doing is essentially they can check on it, right? That's what science is. It's a repetitive process that can be validated and verified by any other scientist, right? So I think that, as we're kind of talking about these theoretical and kind of these sociological issues, I would like to be able to, for the community to, at least read some of the material and kind of, inject themselves into the process as well and kind of give us back feedback.
Thanks, Kevin. Good point. James?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring up I do agree with several on the call for the focus on reuse in the field. I think that is the largest lift. And, eventually, getting to the reuse outside the field, because there's so many hurdles still, particularly for the DJ, for reusing inside the field. So I think that should really be the focus of the time and the effort. On the pilot project side of things, surely industry is already recycling in field and understanding best practices there. I think there's experience and knowledge, and I would, Rick, I don't know if you disagree with this, but I imagine folks would be willing to share. Obviously, you're doing tours of the facility, and Mark as well, Hefta, Chevron. So I think there's already a lot of information and knowledge from industry, particularly the West Slope with Jeff Kirtland and what they're doing with their pipeline. So I think from a pilot perspective, I agree with the case study. You're using what's already out there to fill in some of those gaps. And I think that's where time and effort should be spent. And how do we define a pilot project for reuse in the field? I don't exactly know how that looks versus, let's say, a pilot we're doing in a research lab. And just, I don't know if some folks have forgot, we did do a DJ Basin reuse to theoretical discharge at the Water Technology Hub at School of Mines. Small volume, but the Martinez Irwin Fund funded the data for that. So there is already precedent or data at least for that. Again, if we're looking for data, the state already has that data, or I believe the consortium already has that data, and we're working on a manuscript for that. So sorry for the long drawn out response here, but
No, that's okay. I mean, we're kind of building out and starting to think a little broader than the deliverable, and that's okay. I mean, this conversation is a good conversation. Uh, uh, it's good to hear perspectives, and I think it provides context for Director Dalton as she starts to build out kind of our thoughts around identifying potential barriers, and certainly speaks to what I hope to do in January, which is to really reevaluate our strategic priorities and come up with our own developed deliverables over the next year or two based on the conversations we're having today, based on deliverable 7, and then other elements that this consortium determines are priorities for it to work on over the next year or two as we look to the future. And so appreciate the conversation. I do want to wrap up here relatively soon to go to the deliverable 7 conversation, but go ahead, Harmony.
I think that this conversation highlights a lot about what I learned participating as a party in the cumulative impacts of oil and gas rulemaking. And that even there's a disconnect between this space and that space. And everywhere, to be frank. And this missing data piece, and hearing the comments like, why are we just going off what's based in literature? Like, again, I think James just said it, like there's lots of data available. But I worked in the industry. I know that the industry has all the data available. They are making very informed decisions. They have a lot of money tied to it. And I was just in New York City Climate Week where I met an auditor for Ernst & Young who audited air quality data from oil and gas companies. And he's like, Harmony, they have all the data. They choose what they give to you. And I know because that's exactly what I used to do when I worked in the industry too. ECMC also has a lot of the data and highlighted the need, and again said of how amazing it would be if all the data was in one spot where they could talk to each other, where we could be forward thinking and looking and running models, exactly like Thomas said. This is what people do to make informed decisions, and it's obvious and clear. Observation, you do the scientific method, back to observation. We have stepped so far away from common sense. And Thomas, when can we get a presentation and a tour from you? Are you at the CSU Spur? We're probably neighbors. I don't know where you are. But I just wanted to highlight that. And then a need for this data to be available to stakeholders so we can filter it by product, by basin, by county, by operator. Where would we be today? Because that data, so much of it is sitting in ECMC. And I'll say it here too. Bring me in there for like a month with a couple good data people. Let's pop some stuff. Thomas, you want to come too? Yeah, I see that smile on your face. Like, Irene, come on down. Kevin Chan, Tessa. Let's have a data party. And I know I take us in wild places. Harmony's radical over here, but we need radical change in these times, guys. Like, things are scary in this world. And if we don't start really thinking bigger, bolder, more beautiful and creative for the future, we're going to run out of time.
Thanks, Harmony. So I think at this point we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll meet back at 10:20, 10:29. And then we'll let Hope give us a presentation on deliverable 7 and kind of her perspective on how to move forward with deliverable 7, tying in all of the input that she received today from consortium members, has received over the last couple of weeks, and then I think will receive over the next couple of weeks from individual consortium members as she starts to build out this deliverable. So we'll see everyone at 10:30. Go ahead and get started again. This is the October 11th, 2024 Colorado Produced Water Consortium meeting. Our next item on the agenda is a discussion regarding deliverable 7. I've already said multiple times what deliverable 7 is, so I'll just kick it over to Director Dalton to kick us off.
Thank you, Chair Messner, Hope Dalton, Director. And what a wonderful conversation we've had. I've captured a lot of it, but I do want to go over deliverable 7, which focuses on really our work that we plan on doing for, the homework was 2024, 2025 and 2026, but our strategic plan takes us all the way to 2030. I think with some of your ideas that you shared this morning, we might be using that full time period. And we need to better refine a lot of the discussion today. And I think we'll refine that at our January meeting when we revisit the strategic plan and our strategic priorities. Because if you remember, and a couple of you weren't here in 2023 when we developed the strategic plan, but the strategic plan had focused on the House Bill 23-1242 reports for 23-24, and then all of the other identified strategic priorities say interdate. So by interdate, we'll be doing these things. So we're going to revisit the strategic plan, really define those timelines, and incorporate a lot of the feedback that I heard today. So this presentation is on the report that is due November 1st. I am hoping to include everybody's voice and reach out to you if we need some refinement on that, so that I can deliver this to the General Assembly and state agencies by November 1st. So what is the House Bill 23-1242 requirements? I'm going to read them just because I like to read legislation, as you guys know. So on or before November 1st, 2024, any legislation or agency rules needed to remove barriers to the safe recycling and reuse of produced water in the state, taking into consideration environmental justice issues, any legal issues that may affect the recycling and reuse of produced water, testing standards and procedures for treatment of produced water for both conventional and non-conventional oil and gas exploration and development, research gaps associated with the treatment of produced water, including gaps in addressing emissions from produced water treatment and storage, and any other deficiencies in the treatment of produced water, water sharing agreements, and infrastructure and storage for produced water reuse and recycling, specifically addressing new or existing pits. In plain language, we're going to essentially develop reports that address environmental justice issues, legal issues, testing standards and procedures, research gaps. We might need another report on emissions, a report on water sharing agreements, and a report on infrastructure and storage with a separate report on pits. So all of this this approach has been informed by your homework, which was what do you want to see in 2025 and 2026 for the consortium to do. And I think what's really important is whatever ECMC rules for produced water comes up with in December, we're really going to need to start with that analysis and look at these barriers or opportunities to really address what the ECMC rules are for timeline and targets of increasing reuse and recycling of produced water. So, the results of the homework. You were all assigned homework and you worked with your groups to identify these main topics: environmental justice, legal. There's quite a lot under the legal. I'm imagining once we really refine our concepts in January, and we might find that we need several legal reports. Water rights, testing standards and procedures, air emissions is a big one, water sharing agreements, infrastructure and storage, pits. And what I didn't include on this was really beyond environmental justice is really that community impact. So apologies for missing that bullet. So let's start with environmental justice issues. I learned from when I was presenting at the Colorado Watersheds Conference this week, I learned from Ember that Colorado EnviroScreen 1.0 is likely to be Colorado EnviroScreen 2.0 soon. So that will definitely inform our approach to environmental justice issues. Another item that the consortium is tasked with is reviewing this timeline and targets that we propose to ECMC. And in that is a review of those timeline and targets while looking at population density based on the current census. I believe Tessa put in the chat that Colorado EnviroScreen 2.0 is planned for a release this year in November. So I think the timing is really, really good for us to refine what we're going to work on at our January meeting. So to dive a little deeper into the reports that we would be working on is the liability and legal issues concerning the safe reuse and recycling of produced water. The House bill requires that we report on any legal issues. I believe that we will need to ask for assistance from the Office of the Attorney General to develop white papers related to the complexities, challenges, and opportunities that are associated with legal issues. And so I do think we need that support. Some of the ideas that has come out of the homework is to explore, and this is really not only homework, but many of the consortium's discussions have talked about exploring the classification of treated produced water. Recently, somebody mentioned processed produced water. We do have to have that water sharing agreement report. And what's come out of, I don't know, a really good focus on our last probably 4 or 5 meetings is this quantifying the impact on communities and then interpreting the cumulative impacts rules and how that relates to produced water. There's quite a lot of talk about liability and ownership. Who owns the produced water? You know, it changes hands quite a bit through the process. There may be some limitations on our ability to increase infrastructure. Again, that will be informed by the ECMC rulemaking that occurs in December. We've had some talk about incentives, fees, trades, those mechanisms, and we would need a legal perspective on that. We proposed in our timelines and targets an equivalency for produced water. We really need to know what is that. We haven't had time to really identify what is an equivalency. We'll be doing another report on storage and treatment per the bill, and that separate report will have some legal implications and then legal considerations when we are exploring using produced water outside the oil field. Something that's been talked about quite a bit at our recent meetings is potential of using disposal wells as storage reservoirs for produced water and what that looks like if we were to withdraw the water for additional use. And so looking at water law as it is presented right now, especially Division of Water Resources and well permitting, we need to get that regulatory framework in place while also working on, is it even technologically possible? And so the ultimate goal is to look at water law with the concept of how do we replace freshwater use in oil and gas industry and with some non-fresh water. So again, talking about those disposal wells, I put the graph. This is from our produced water availability report that we submitted for August 1st. And we need to explore the potential to use these disposal wells as potential storage reservoirs. And, you know, we need to look at the technology, the legal authority, and the regulatory requirements. Moving on to produced water treatment, the House requires that we address testing standards and procedures for treatment of produced water for both conventional and non-conventional oil and gas exploration and development. We haven't really done this yet, so it will be informed by our July 1st report. I put the legal language on this slide. On or before July 1st, 2025, evaluate analytical and toxicological methods employed during produced water treatment and assess tools used to evaluate produced water and its potential for use outside the oil field. And so we will be doing this report will probably take all of the first half of 2025. It has to be our priority. It's a legislative requirement. But later on, this, I think we'll go back to this produced water treatment probably several times over the course of 2025, 2026, and into 2030. So first get that 2025 report done, and then we'll revisit the timeline for this produced water treatment report. The House bill requires that we address research gaps associated with produced water, including gaps in addressing emissions from produced water treatment and storage and other deficiencies in the treatment of produced water. That's the requirement. I have potentially 3 reports to work on, which would be the considerations for different levels of treated produced water, research gaps, and then preparing a report specifically addressing air emissions. And this would be informed by past House Bill 23-1242 reports, which we completed this year. The idea of the life cycle analysis model might inform these research gaps, revisiting strategic priorities from, and we'll be doing that in January of next year. New research, pilot programs, also mentioned in today's discussion as case studies. The House bill requires that we do a report on water sharing agreements. I think the approach to this might be to review current agreements and get that legal assistance with the complexity that ownership of produced water presents. Infrastructure and storage, I think this is a really big topic that will take a lot of time. The House bill requirement is infrastructure and storage for produced water reuse and recycling, specifically addressing new or existing pits. So the recommended report is the potential risks and benefits of storage and transportation to communities, and then prepare a specific report addressing new or existing hits. So our approach to this would be to use the key findings from our previous House Bill 23-1242 reports that we've completed this year, identify new research and pilot programs, identify and use data and information on emissions, and then incorporate community input. So our recommendations that are proposed to be included in this November 1st report is the consortium should conduct further data analysis and research, resulting in reports to the General Assembly and state agencies. And the topics would be environmental justice, liability and legal issues, including potential to propose a statutory change relating to withdrawing water that has been previously injected into disposal wells. A report on research gaps, including, again, looking at those disposal wells and specifically emissions, because we just have not had any time in 2024 to address the complexity that looking at emissions, especially from a community point of view, those are challenges, and we just haven't had the time to look at those. So I would propose that we identify those research gaps before, and then fill them, and then present a report on that. Then another report would be looking at the different levels of treated produced water, and that would include testing standards and procedures, and be informed by the July 1st, 2025 report, looking specifically at water sharing agreements. Many of us have not even seen a water sharing agreement, so there are plenty of opportunities to learn more about water sharing agreements by inviting experts and really delving into what that means. And then the potential risks and benefits of storage and transportation to communities, which includes really diving deep into that infrastructure and storage question. So the key takeaways, let's apply all the work we've done since September 2023. We've done so much, and New Mexico, Texas, even the EPA, because we have an action item on the water reuse action plan. Everybody's looking at Colorado. Everybody's saying great work is coming out of Colorado Produced Water Consortium. Let's apply it. Let's also not forget our strategic plan. A lot of organizations just write it up and put it on a bookshelf and forget about it. Let's revisit it. Let's give ourselves some reasonable deadlines that allows us to really look into these topics that are complex from a legal standpoint, regulatory standpoint, technology, community. We just need more time. So let's revisit our strategic plan. Let's not force ourselves into unreasonable timelines. And then let's implement the recommendations of the reports we've already done. The development of a glossary, I know several people have not forgotten that, and they remind me ever since we put it in our March 1st report as something that we found, and then in our May 1st report, which was about regulatory coordination, was even identifying all of the definitions that are out there, and perhaps looking at coordinating with other regulatory agencies on a common definition. And then, we have several regulatory coordination opportunities that we identified in that May 1st report. Let's start implementing those, as well as what comes out of this November 1st report and what will come out of our December 1st and our July 1st, 2025 reports. So back to you, Commissioner Messner, and I can take questions or we can launch into the discussion.
Thanks, Director Dalton. Appreciate the overview there, and certainly a I feel a little overwhelmed already. That's a lot of topics, but I appreciate that compilation of those and kind of lining out the work that we can hopefully expect to do. And so I think at this point, let's direct questions to Director Dalton if folks have questions about what she's presented at this point. So we'll start with Barbara.
Thank you, Chair Messner. Water sharing agreements came up several times in your presentation, Hope, and Group 3 had quite a robust discussion about water sharing versus the development of commercial, if you will call them midstream, produced water treatment companies. And when you look at the challenges in the DJ Basin in particular, where the amount of produced water coming up for a given operator is probably insufficient at a particular time to be able to use to complete another well, we envision that there will be a growth in these midstream. So that is a very different kind of agreement than an operator water agreement, water sharing agreement. And to the point you were making, Commissioner Messner, about the need to look at the ownership and liability questions. Jeff can comment on this. It certainly came up if we are to change the classification of produced water from an E&P waste to a commodity, if you will. And maybe, Jeff, you want to speak to that.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. You know, from a practical standpoint, the current experience that we have with water sharing is certainly between operator and operator. And I think the important component there is that there is no value exchanged or charged on that water for that water share. And so when you're dealing with an arrangement on a commercial side, I think we need more clarification about how that would work. Now, there could be value exchanged with respect to the transportation or the pumping associated with transporting that water, but the water itself has no value because of its current nature. So I think that was really the main point. But understanding the difference between operator to operator versus operator to commercial provides a new challenge that we need to understand. Thank you, Bert.
And so maybe the to include in the November 1st deliverable 7 would be just to identify the two different concepts, one being operator to operator, one being operator to commercial. Is that? But I don't want to get too detailed in the report, but I do want to identify and capture these things for further discussion. Is that?
I think that's important to have at least that minimum expansion to consider a commercial intermediary between the produced water operator and the future operator use.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up. I'm giving Director Dalton just a second before I have Mike. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair Messner. Mike Freeman here. So I just had a couple of thoughts. One, a question and one more of a comment. The question was, in the draft report, it talked about looking at whether there'd be some changes needed in terms of water rights or division of water resources for pulling water out of Class 2 wells. And I understand that. That makes sense to me. One question I had when reading it is whether there may be some legal changes needed at the ECMC as well, because the ECMC is the agency that permits those. And I just don't know the answer to this, but whether there may be some regulatory changes needed there for pulling things out as well as injecting them. And so it may be worth in the report saying, DWR and ECMC just to make sure we're covering the waterfront. And like I said, I just don't know whether there would be any changes but it might be worth mentioning it in the report. And EPA, as Michelina says too, that's a good point. The other thought I had is more of a comment. And I mean, I really like the idea of asking the AG's office for a series of white papers about a number of these legal issues. I think that would be really helpful in putting a lot of the questions we've been talking about into much sharper focus, laying out what the law is, getting a clear baseline for us to think about. And I think that would let us make some much better informed recommendations and for new rule changes or statutory changes. So I think that's a fantastic idea. One thing I just hope we can do is, if the AG's office is available to help us there, is make this, I don't know, an iterative process, or have an opportunity for consortium members who to work with or confer or make comments to the AG's office about the different white papers as they're being developed, because I think our input could help make sure that those white papers answer the right questions, answer questions that we may have, so that we get the answers that were most useful. And I think having more minds on the issue might also help the AG's white papers think about all the ideas that might be available, or different legal frames for solving some of those issues. So I think both in terms of asking the right questions and getting the most useful answers, it would be great if we could have some back and forth with the AG's office as those are being developed, just so that we get the best, kind of most useful, workable set of answers we can. But I think the idea of doing the white papers is a really great one.
John, you're
Hey,
muted.
John, you're on mute.
Well, I was just waxing poetic, but appreciate the comments, Mike. I think it's a good thought, and I think there's a good conversation to refine in January. I think we've identified that the white papers are a good idea. I think having some time to provide some thoughts and discussion, prior to the development of those, I think that all makes sense, and I think that that's something that we can work through in January, and then moving forward. And then I wonder, on your first point, just so that Hope has something clear to put in the report, if we just even broaden it a little further and say, state and federal agencies generally, is that too broad, or is that okay?
I think that's fine with me. I really just raised the question whether the scope of the agencies that might bear on this is broader than DWR, but I think whether we do state and federal agencies, or DWR, ECMC, and EPA, whatever you think is the right scale would be good for me. So.
Thank you, Chair Messner and Michael. This is Hope Dalton, Director. That does provide me clarity. I think that I will be more, I would like to propose to be more general and say state agencies, because I'd like these reports to go to all the state agencies that we've identified. One state agency that we haven't sent our previous report to is the Colorado Attorney General's office. And so I was thinking of potentially just including them, at least on this report, because it has a recommendation to work with them. I'd like to really stay to state and federal agencies, because I'd like to really look at, with the consortium's help, what are those state and federal agencies, instead of limiting it just to ECMC, Division of Water Resources, CDPHE, because there might be others, like State Land Board maybe. So I want to be able to have flexibility there. Is that okay, Michael? Thank you.
Miguelina, I think you wrote something in the chat. Do you just want to ask your question?
Thank you, Chair Michelina Pollock. I just wanted to mention that maybe we could also use, as well as the AG's office, is consulting with outside counsel that has more specific knowledge on water law. Like, for instance, I have a pretty complex issue here with non-tributary and tributary water, specific to the San Juan Basin, but I know how complicated water law is. So just from my agriculture background. So I think it would behoove us to have an expansive legal counsel. Is that in our budget? Hope, just kidding.
No. We do have budget. Speaking of budget, we do have budget through June 30th of 2025. And then our budget drops to just the stipends for the consortium members to attend quarterly virtual meetings in 25-26. So yes, I have some consultant vendor funds of 45,000, so probably not enough for a water lawyer, but I do have some funds in this fiscal year.
Thanks, Hope. Tracy?
I just thought I'd mention with that comment, the AG's office does have attorneys in the Water Resources Unit who are water law experts. So I guess I don't know that it'd be necessary to go to outside counsel.
Thanks, Tracy. Other questions for Hope on what she's presented? Irene.
Irene Andrus, Hope, do you want to go into more discussion on the methods to approach additional reports that you have in the deliverable about the continued work and working with outside groups and subgroups and things of that nature? Thank you.
And that's a great question, Irene. Hope Dalton, Director. And in the report that was shared, the draft report that was shared, I mentioned items that I do have budget for through 2025. And so that would be additional, we can have an additional on-site meeting of consortium members in the on the Western Slope. And I'm thinking about that in the May-June timeframe and combining it with a tour. I'm not to put anyone on the spot because they can always refuse, but I have asked Commissioner Doug Overton and Jeff Kirtland to work together on developing that kind of approach with, and again, it's not really ready for prime time, but I would like Commissioner Doug Overton to host our meeting and then for Jeff to figure out the tour and host the tour. And then the other things that I have budget for what I'm calling listening sessions, but the listening sessions are not the traditional, I go to a rec center and, present and talk at people, but more of, and these are ideas that need better, they're not ready yet. They're just concepts right now, but I've talked to Nikki Wells, I've talked to Harmony, I've talked to Jolie about how do you listen to communities and is it a music festival? is it like a community dinner? You know, like Buena Vista has a community dinner where you just sit around a table and people just talk about, you know, a topic as well as, you know, life in Colorado. And so I have some budget for that. And I have some budget for additional meetings by the consortium in that first half of the year. And then, of course, I have working on the story map, that concept of having all the data in one place, as well as the narrative, and really taking that community input and seeing, you know, can we really use this? I like the idea that Kevin had today about, you know, community science. And so I was thinking the consultant would be more used for helping with that data visualization and accessing, you know, all of the databases at once. So that's kind of the approach that I meant when in this vague paragraph about method to approach additional reports.
Great. And we're refining. I think Director Dalton, you're continuing to refining that initial draft. I mean, the initial draft was just an initial draft, and it continues to refine based on conversations today.
Correct.
And future conversations. So, Harmony?
Sorry, my internet is cutting out, so I'm moving around. I want to add on to what Director Dalton said. And when I was at Climate Week, I got to see a panel put on by the director for New York City's Environmental Justice Department. And they had a data map, just what she was saying, that had 100 different data points and could be drilled down by up to the bureau and things like that in New York. And so that might be a good example of something to look at that's already been creative, that seemed like an exciting tool in this space. And so it's always better to not have to start from scratch. The other thing is I am very passionate about elevating community and marginalized voices in decision-making and rulemakings. I would like to extend an invitation to the members of the consortium to a meeting that we're hosting, and I should back up 1 second. I run a community space in North Denver's Gloveville-Elyria-Swansea neighborhood that pairs music, movement, arts with elevating community voice, environmental policy work, and healing. We have an opportunity with the Air Quality Control Commissioners, the State Board of Health, to come and do an in-person tour with us, intermingled with community perspectives, while also hearing from Director Michael Ogletree, different people on different rulemakings, different things. Jolie is going to be there, and it would be a really exciting time. We're going to have 16 medical students there to really talk about the intersections, the cumulative impacts of all these things, and try to break down silos and build rainbows and bridges between decision makers, community members, and now maybe we could add more academia and industry to that as well, because we do need to come together to really look at these issues and problems to really have holistic, informed decisions and solutions. And so I can send an email to Hope to send to folks too. Thank you.
Thanks, Harmony. Barbara?
Yeah, just quickly, I wanted to comment that within Group 3 anyway, doing our homework, we're all very appreciative of the opportunity to have this offline working group environment to have broader, deeper discussions. And I don't know if the other groups felt the same way, but Hope, when you're talking about having working groups, we have 31 members of this consortium that come with many different areas of expertise. And if we had that opportunity without the time restrictions and the focus of these particular consortium meetings to delve into particular topics, we might be more useful to you. Just a comment.
Thank you, Barbara. Hope Dalton, Director. So the concept of work groups, I know, has been around since our first meeting in September of 2023. The problem with work groups is the stipend, which relates to the budget. So I'm hoping at the January meeting, we can identify potential timeline. And I'm putting way too much on the January meeting agenda. So, right, take it with a grain of salt. But if we can identify how often work groups would need to meet and then, arrange it so that they would report out at a consortium meeting, then I can make the budget, especially if we can identify who's going to be on each work group, because there's different stipends associated with who is. As we've kind of explored the concept of work groups over this past 2024 year, it appears everybody is interested in every work group. So if we can refine that, and I was thinking of refining it based on these reports. And so we would have a work group for each of the reports that we're proposing.
Oh, I have to ask the question, when we had the homework assignment, I don't think anybody was expecting a stipend for their time. Are you saying that if you create formal work groups, stipend is required?
The formal work groups, and I would have to get legal opinions on it, but formal work groups need to be, we have to invite the public to formal work groups, and then we would have to have a meeting. We would have to record the meeting, put the meeting on the website for the public, take public comment at the work groups. And so the homework has been extremely informal, and it's really, the reason we've had homework is because our meetings are going too long. And so we would normally have had breakout groups at our meeting, and then the breakout groups would report about their discussion. So the homework is very different than a work group.
Well, and I do think, I'm acknowledging Barbara and many consortium members' desire for work groups. I would like to continue to explore this because I do see the value in it, of having smaller, more in-depth discussions, and so I think there's opportunities here, and I would suggest, Director Dalton, that we just put it as a goal, and then let's have further conversations about how to make that happen, because I do think that it is a value add for sure. So probably at this point, it would be good to wrap this discussion up. And maybe Director Dalton, I think next step is if you could just reiterate, kind of summarize how you see the next steps are, understanding that you're going to deliver this on November 1st. We're providing you the direction and the authority to take all of these thoughts that have been developed, compile them into a refined report, and then distribute that to consortium members and to the public before the November 1st deliverable. Does anyone have any concerns or questions about that? And well, maybe I'll wait until Director Dalton gives us her summary before I ask that question.
Thank you, Chair Messner. Hope Dalton, Director. The approach I would like to take with Deliverable 7 is to incorporate what I've heard today, but be a little more vague on the details, capture the main report and what was included in the homework. So I feel like we have a really solid report that needs a little bit of editing. I'd like to reach out to individual consortium members to make sure that I've captured what they've said today. And then I would like to do that over the next week. And then the following week, which is the week of October 21st, I'd like to send that to leadership for review, and I would be happy to also send that to the consortium members at that time, and then make any edits that last week of October and submit it to the General Assembly and state agencies on, I guess that's a Thursday. Oh, Friday, November 1st. Is everybody okay if I reach out to you next week to get the edits?
Yeah, my only request, Director, would be that it's very clear in the report that this is not that these are for further discussion. These are not direct recommendations on things that should or shall happen from a recommendation standpoint, but that these are reports and concepts that are to be further evaluated over the next couple of years, so that there's not a misconception that we've already had these conversations and these are our recommendations, right? And well, I just want to emphasize that.
I agree, and that's where I'm struggling a little bit, is I would like to be a little more vague in this report so that we don't tie ourselves to these ideas that we've come up very quickly. You know, the ideas are almost in a brainstorming phase and they need to be discussed at length. I'd like to be a lot more vague in this report so that we have more opportunities to research and develop these ideas. So I will for certain make sure that this is for further discussion, but I'd like to reach out to some consortium members and ask them if it's okay that we remove some of the specifics as well. But
and my favorite word in that situation is including but not limited to.
Oh, I like that too. Thank you.
So questions on this process? Anyone have any concerns with what Director Dalton's proposing? Okay. Mission accomplished there. And so next item on the agenda is, well, I should never say this, but I think it's a pretty easy one, which is an update on deliverable 8 regarding short and long-term goals. This is really just a repackaging of our recommendations to ECMC on the short and long-term reuse and recycling targets and dates that we've developed already. And so I'll give it back over to Director Dalton just to explain that one. This is a repackaging for a different audience.
Thank you, Chair Messner. And so you've already seen our recommendations to ECMC, and you know, it started with a letter and then a report afterwards. I'm going to the report and incorporate the letter into a full report that would be sent to the General Assembly and state agencies. There may be a little shift on the tone because in the ECMC recommendations, it felt to me like there was a focus on increasing reuse and recycling of produced water downhole. I want to shift that tone a little bit to focusing on reducing freshwater use in oil and gas industry. And so you'll see that draft report probably the week of Halloween, so October 28th. And then you can add comments at that time. Our next meeting will be November 15th, So it'll be a shorter meeting like this. It'll be 9 to 12 virtual, and similar to what we're doing today, we'll open the floor for discussion of that report. Hopefully everybody will have ample time to add their comments into the report, because I'm exhausted. I am sure you're exhausted too. And so I am going on a trip overseas where I will not have access to email the very next day. So I will incorporate all of your comments the same day, that November 15th, and then you'll have a little time to review if you're working the week of Thanksgiving. But really, there'll be limited time to review before it's submitted on December 1st. So that's the approach. I would like, before we take comments on that, I would like to ask a question of Tracy. Tracy, I was hoping to work with someone at DWR on that freshwater perspective, and I was hoping that you could email me a contact at DWR that could help with that freshwater perspective.
Sure.
Okay, any questions on that? Understanding that this is really, again, just a repackaging of what we've already accomplished to a different audience. And so I'm hoping it's not, like, I don't think we need to reinvent this report, but any questions for Director Dalton? Barbara?
I have a question beyond that, if it's appropriate or can wait behind anybody else's questions.
I'll just put a pause on that question just for a second. I'll see if we can wrap it. It's on this topic or not on this topic?
It's on a different topic. Thank you.
Okay. I want to wrap this up. And then, is there anyone that has any concerns or questions about this so that Hope can move forward with this concept? Okay. Mission accomplished on that one. So Barbara.
Yeah, just a quick ask, if we can make sure that all consortium members are included in ECMC rulemaking for Produced Water Consortium, any notices that go out to the public. I think it would be very helpful for those of us who are interested in.
Yeah, I think so. Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. So if there's something posted on the ECMC website regarding the rulemaking, that we send it out to consortium members, is that the ask?
That is the ask. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to try to stay on top of that. Sometimes I miss it, but I will do the best that I can to make sure that consortium members are informed about what's happening with that rulemaking. So
thank you.
Yeah.
And Chair Messner, Hope Dalton, Director again, I am happy to take that off of your plate and work with the communication staff at ECMC so that I don't get the notifications, Barbara, so that was a good reminder, so that I get the notifications and then I'll share it with the consortium members. Does that sound okay, Chair Messner?
Sure. I'm not sure how many notifications go out versus they get posted on the website. So it may be a proactive thing.
It may be what?
It may be more of a proactive thing than just getting. So, but anyway, I'll do offline on that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? And I do think, I'm hoping that, that we don't have too long of a meeting in November. I know that we've been working Hope silly, all the other staff silly. This group has been great about getting together on a monthly basis, more than a monthly basis. It's been a super long year for everyone. I want to make sure that we have a little bit of a break, end of year through the holidays here so that we can get back together refreshed in the new year. And so I think, Hope is scheduling that meeting from 9 to 12. I really don't think it's going to take that long. And so let's see as we get closer to it if we can refine that and make it as short of a meeting as we need. And I don't want to cut anyone off or have any discussions that need to happen not happen. But I do want to give everyone a break. And then December we will not have a meeting, and then we'll kind of reset again in the new year. Any questions about any of that? Director Dalton, any final comments? I think that's the last item on the agenda.
I have nothing but praise for all of the consortium members and consortium staff. We've accomplished so much and really, really appreciate all of your perspectives and thank you. I know I'm not the only one who's exhausted. Many consortium members have reached out to me saying, are we really going to have this much work to do next year? So hopefully it evens out as we start to develop our own timeline and deliverables. So thank you all.
Thanks, Director Dalton. Rick?
So with that in mind, in my understanding correctly, that when we move into 2025, we're going to move to quarterly meetings of the consortium. Is that correct, Director Dalton?
Thank you, Rick. Hope Dalton, Director. So kind of. So I have funding through June 30th, 2025. We're going to move to bi-monthly. So it'll be, I will work with Chair Messner on this schedule, but tentatively right now, it'll be January, March, May, and potentially June. And one of them will be in person on the Western Slope.
Okay.
And then our new fiscal year starts, so they'll go to quarterly, which will tentatively be August, October. I don't know when we'll want to meet, February and May.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask, so we may want to, the earlier discussion regarding whatever we want to call them, homework groups or work groups or breakout groups, we may want to try to refine that concept to where that can be a reality, because as we start moving the formal meetings further and further apart, we're probably going to find a need for smaller groups to have to fill gaps and put information together and recommendations for the rest of the team before we move into the next formal meeting.
Good point, Rick. Thanks for that. AG Davenport?
Thanks, Chair. I did just want to note for the record that we had a quorum today. We had 16 or more, depending on the time, consortium members in attendance.
Thanks. I actually forgot to count at the beginning of the meeting, so I'm glad that we did. Otherwise, we would have spent a lot of time on an unofficial meeting.
At the beginning, we had 20.
Okay. Anything else? Well, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time today, and this may be the first time we've ended a meeting a half hour early, and so well done everyone, and enjoy the Halloween holiday, and we'll see everyone in November. So thanks.